Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. I'm Ross, and I'm live from the Athenaeum in Jackson, Louisiana, home of HOREB Institute for the Historical and Objective Research and Exploration of the Bible, and home of United Israel World Union Center South. Thank you very much for joining me today for my class, Divine Blueprint, ? The Priestly Pattern and the Ark. So we've got a lot to unpack today, and I am glad that you're here with me to do just that. We're working through the Pentateuch. We're following roughly the annual cycle of readings according to the Jewish annual cycle. We're in the part called the Life and Laws of Moses. We come to meet Moses at the beginning of Exodus. So we're in the book of Exodus. We are in Torah portion, Terumah, which begins in Exodus chapter 25, verse 1, and goes through chapter 27 and verse 19. Now, just to set the stage, now that we have hit Exodus chapter 25, we're dealing with a matter, a subject matter, that is the central point of everything which follows in the Pentateuch. So there's more about the subject that I'm about to enter into than there is anything else in the Pentateuch, and that is concerning from Exodus chapter 25, verse 1, through the end of the book of Exodus, all the way through the end of chapter 40. What we're dealing with is a focus on the construction of a terrestrial home for the God of heaven. We're going to build a holy place where God can dwell in the midst of his people. This is priestly material, so get ready. So what I want to do is I want to tell you that so from 25, verse 1, all the way to the end of Exodus, we're dealing with this material, but now I'm going to break that down just a little bit to give you an overview. From chapter 25, verse 1 through chapter 31 and verse 17, we're dealing with the collection of raw materials and the instructions for construction of what's called a Mikdash, what's called also a Mishkan. In fact, in today's Torah portion, Terumah is an offering, that which is lifted up. I use offering because I'm using the English term there. But basically, what this Torah portion begins with is a solicitation for things that are going to go into making this terrestrial home for God. So, again, Mikdash and Mishkan, these are two words that we're going to deal with from here on out. So you got to know them. Mikdash is a word that's rooted in the idea of holy, kadosh. We know this word kadosh. A Mikdash is what is holy, or what is a holy place, right? And then the other word that we're dealing with is Mishkan. Mishkan has to do with the root word to live or to dwell, shkan. Some of you have heard of the Shekinah, or as we say in the South, the Shekinah, the glory, as some people would call it. But the Mishkan is a dwelling place, and the Mikdash is a holy place. And the two are often used interchangeably for the space that we're dealing with now in the unfolding story and narrative according to the Pentateuch. So when we talk about from chapter 25, verse 1 through chapter 31 and verse 17, what we're dealing with, again, is the collection of the materials, the actual instructions for the construction, and various other things. So the overview is that. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper, what we're going to deal with is the tabernacle proper, from the inner sanctum to the outer courtyard. So it's all of everything about the construction, the instructions for the construction of this, from the inner chamber, the sanctum sanctorum, if you will, all the way to the outer courts. We're going to deal with sacred furniture that goes within this holy place, within this Mikdash, and within the Mishkan itself. So we're going to deal with not only the sacred furniture, but the location. What is it? What's it to look like? How is it to be constructed with some level of detail, not a lot. And then we're dealing with things such as the ark. You've heard of the ark, right? The table, altars, not just the altar for sacrifice, but an altar for incense. We're also dealing with a lampstand, a washing basin, and so forth. And all of this cool stuff is going to be built, constructed by two spirit-filled artisans by the name of Bezalel and Aholiab. Bezalel and Aholiab. Remember these guys. They're going to be a big part of our story as it unfolds. Now, we're also dealing with the priesthood. So in some ways, this is the introduction to the priest. And we're going to be dealing with priests, particularly Aaron's sons, the priest, or the only priest, according to the priestly writer, are descendants of Aaron. So we're going to deal with the priesthood, the selection, the consecration, the ordination. There's this term that says to fill the hand. So we're not only, and the anointing, by the way, you have to anoint the priest. So, and by the way, according to the Pentateuch, the only anointed one, the only Messiah, are the priest, particularly Aaron and his sons. They are referred to as Messiahs, biblically, completely and biblically. The Pentateuch, or the Torah, if you will, knows nothing of a king that is to be the Messiah. And if you want to run to Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, hold your horses. That's not what that's talking about anyway, and it's late, and we'll get to that later. But as far as the messianic aspects of the Pentateuch, the only Messiah is the priest. So we're going to deal with not only the selection, the consecration, the anointing, the ordination, the filling of the hand, as we work our way through this section of the Pentateuch, but you also get instructions, directions, a recipe for various things like the proper way to make the incense and what is forbidden in terms of the incense, and the anointing oil. If you're going to have messiahs, you have to have the proper anointing oil. And also, one other point on messiahs, you have to get this idea out of your head that a Messiah is just a person, because we're going to have Messiah crackers. We're going to have anointed objects, all in line with what the Bible talks about in terms of what is a Messiah. Now, all I did was just cover from chapter 25, verse 1 through 31:17 in my big high-level overview. When you get to chapter 32 through 34, we're dealing with two theaters. It's almost like you're in a movie theater and you're sitting in a room with two different screens and two different films are playing. On the one film is what's going on the mountain with Moses and God, and maybe Joshua a little bit, not all the time, sometimes. And then on the other theater, now this can be confusing if you're not careful. The other film that's playing at the same time, the volumes are both up, is the story of what's going on down below, like in the camp. So you've got the story of the camp being played out, and you've got the story of what's going on the mountain with Moses and God. So you got a below and above, but for my illustration, they're side by side. So the people and Moses, and then there's this big scandalous thing that goes on down there, and Moses is told about it, and this becomes one of the central parts in the unfolding story, right? So we're going to get to that, not this week, but we're going to lay the groundwork for it. And then there is a recovening that has to take place because of the fallout of what happens down there while Moses is up there. And that's a whole nother story, but it's all related. We're going to get to that. And that's chapters 32 through 34. And then the last 6 chapters, from chapter 35 to chapter 40, is actually bringing about what was described in chapters 25 through 31. So 25 through 31 says, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to build, this is how you're going to do it, this is where it goes in the finished product, and this is who's going to make it, and so forth. And then 32 and 34 is a train wreck, and then 35 through 40 is actually making what you just heard about. So there's a lot of repetition, words, phrases, stories, narrative flow that we meet in 25 through 31. It's almost like reading it all over again in 35 through 40. The difference is one describes it being made, the other describes it being made. Wait a minute, something like that. One describes how it's going to be made, the other describes the actual making thereof. That's better. Okay. And then the way the story sort of wraps up is that the Mishkan, the Mikdash, is finally built and erected and consecrated, and then it ends finally, the book of Exodus finally ends with an anachronistic summary of the wilderness journeys. In other words, somebody later, much later, goes back and edits in a certain section to kind of catch the reader up on what happened during their wilderness journeys and so forth. So that's what we have to talk about over the next several weeks, and it is going to be exciting. Look, we're talking about things that are a major part of the story of the Pentateuch. This is some of the greatest material. It's given, it's given the raw material for some of the greatest books and movies and ideas, and, you know, from the time we're in Sunday school and we learn about all these things. I mean, think about it. Just the Ark of the Covenant. You know, if we look at the story about the building of the Ark and what was it used for and how it's such a central part in the story, the biblical narrative, all the way until it just simply vanishes. I mean, the Ark of the Covenant, the most important part of the everything that deals with the tabernacle and so forth, and it's such a integral part of the story, poof, and then it's gone. And we're going to get to some of this. And Jeremiah, later, towards the end of the time, probably about the time it disappears, says it really doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter that it's gone. In fact, I'm not even going to think about it anymore. Interesting. But I have a question. We're talking about the building of a terrestrial home for God, a home made with hands of man for the living God to live in. Can God dwell on earth? It's a big question. It's a big question. And as with so many things, there is a tension in the text. So the question again is, can God live in a house, in a tent, or a temple? And we're not going to look at every bit of this detail, but we're going to at least lay the groundwork for some of it. So I want to look at, to kind of get an idea of the tension in the text, I want to look at a few passages that sort of lay out the case that God can live and will live and chooses to live in a man-made shrine in the midst of humans. And the first of these verses is Exodus chapter 25, verse 8 and 9. Exodus 25, verse 8 and 9. This is on page 144 of the Exodus tablet. This is towards the beginning of our Torah portion, and it says the following. This is written as if from the mouth of God. And let them make me a sanctuary, a Mikdash, that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, the pattern of the tabernacle, the pattern of all the furniture thereof, even so shall ye make it. Now look at chapter 29, verse 45. This is page 180. We're going to come back to that 25, 8, 9 passage I just read, but we're going to do that later. We're going to lay some groundwork first. 29, verse 45 on page 180. And I will dwell among the children of Israel and will be their God, and will be their God. Now, I'm going to switch to the JPS. Forgive me for this, but I'm going to use my Jewish Study Bible because it is at hand, and I want to look at 1 Kings 6, verse 13. So here we go. This is a JPS translation. God speaking. In fact, in verse 11, it says, the word of the Lord came to Solomon with regards to this house you're building, etc. Verse 13 says, I, God, will abide among the children of Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. Let's look at one more. You see more on the screen than I'm going to read, but look at Ezekiel 37. Ezekiel 37, many of you know a lot of these passages. Chapter 37, verse 26 through 28 is what I'm going to read. I will make, this is God speaking according to the text, I will make a covenant of friendship with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them. I will establish them, multiply them, and I will place my sanctuary, Mikdash, among them forever. My presence shall rest over them. I will be their God. They shall be my people. And when my sanctuary abides among them forever, the nations shall know that I, the Lord, do sanctify Israel. You'll see other passages. And believe me, I know you know this because you are all excellent Bible students and scholars, that there are many, 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 many texts in the Hebrew Bible that says God, the Creator God, is going to dwell in the midst of his people. Now, some people would say, yeah, well, that means more of an internalization inside of the people in their midst, like in the inner parts, and not necessarily to live in a house, etc. But we're going to look at a couple of these passages, which I already said there's sort of this tension that God, these texts say God's going to live in the middle of them, right in the midst. And so there's another side of the story that says, no. Let's look at a few of these. Let's look at Isaiah 66, beginning, let's just read verse 1. That's all we need to do right now. Thus says the Lord, the heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Where could you build a house for me? What place could serve as my abode? Verse 2, all this was made by my hand, and thus it all came to being, declares the Lord. In other words, if God was going to live in a house, who's going to build it? Where's it going to be? What's it going to look like, etc.? Other biblical writers have this same pause when it comes to, is God going to live here? Like here. Where would he live? Probably in the south, if you ask me, but that's okay. Look at 1 Kings chapter 8, and before you laugh at that and think that I'm being sort of silly, God does come from the south. There are several passages that show that, but we'll do that maybe in the after-class discussion. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27. This is part of the dedication of King Solomon. Solomon will say this, but will God really dwell on the earth? Even the heavens to their uttermost reaches cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? So you might say, yeah, Solomon gets it. Solomon gets it. Yeah, I mean, because he's building this house for God, but he says, can God really dwell on earth in a house made by human hands? And the obvious answer to that, according to this writer in Kings, is no. Now, look with me at 2 Chronicles. Now, this is Kings and Chronicles often tell the same story. Sometimes they tell that same story differently. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, let's look at 2 Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 18. So this is the harmonistic, the synoptic text to what we just read there in 1 Kings 8. Does God really dwell with man on earth? Even the heavens to their uttermost reaches cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built. So one of the compromises that the biblical writers make when they entertain the question, they've got this tension in the text. Can God live on earth? Yes, not only will he, does he want to, but he chooses to. He wants to live in the midst of his people. So not only is the answer to the question for some biblical writers, yes, God can live in the midst of his people and will live in the midst of the people, but there are good descriptions of what that looks like and how that's going to come about. Now, on the other side, because of the tension, and we have another group of writers which say, no, 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 one of the compromises is they say, well, the house that's built is technically not God's house. Like he's not going to live there. His presence can come there because it is a sanctified space. And this is where we get into, like in the Torah now where we are, we're dealing with zones of holiness, which the modern reader has basically, for the most part, lost connection with. We don't understand this anymore widely. But so that rather than say God, it's going to be God's house, it's a house for God's name. This is the way some writers fix this. So while we're in 2 Chronicles, flip back to 2 Chronicles chapter 2, and I want to read verse 4 through 6. The house that I intend to build will be great, inasmuch as our God is greater than all gods. Who indeed is capable of building a house for him? By the way, this is Solomon, and Solomon knows how to build a house for God. He builds a house for everybody's God. If he's got a girlfriend from the Mediterranean coast, he'll build their God a house too. So he's really become quite the God house builder. And it's no exception for him just to put another one up on the block. There are as many houses for gods that Solomon built as there are churches in my little local town, guaranteed. Who indeed, verse 5, is capable of building a house for him? Even the heavens to their uttermost reaches cannot contain him. And who am I that I should build a house for him? Here we go. Except as a place for making burnt offerings to him. Okay? Now, send me craftsmen to work in gold and silver and bronze and iron and purple and crimson and blue yarn, and who knows how to engrave alongside the craftsmen I have here in Judah and in Jerusalem, whom my father David provided. In some texts, what we get is that this is a house for the name of God, right? Look back at verse 3. See, I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. I'll dedicate it to him for making incense offering of sweet spices in his honor, for the regular rows of bread and morning and evening burnt offerings on Sabbaths, new moons, and festivals, as is Israel's eternal duty. Now remember, the chronicler is the official sanctioned writer for the kingdom. So it's going to have a different view often than what we read in Kings. But what the chronicler here is going to make it a point that the purpose of the house, since it can't be really a house for God, it's going to be a house for God's name and, oh, by the way, for this whole sacrificial cult. And that is one of the main things that is stressed in these particular passages. Now, Kings is not going to leave that part out because everybody wants to promote the sacrificial cult. All of these priestly writers, there is a difference we're going to talk about. Now, I do want you to look with me at 1 Kings 8. Remember, this is the text in 1 Kings which deals with the dedication of the temple. And so I want to look at 1 Kings 8 because I want to make a very interesting point that I think you'll be able to see, and it's really going to stand out for you, particularly later when you can look at this together with, spend a little bit more time on it. So if I look at 1 Kings 8 and 5, 1 Kings 8 and 5, this is prior to the dedicatory service that Solomon has. This is on the way to the house. In verse 5, it says, "Meanwhile, King Solomon and the whole community of Israel, who were assembled with him before the ark, were sacrificing sheep and oxen in such abundance that they could not be numbered or counted." There you go. I mean, this is just, you couldn't even count them. In fact, in another text, it talks about 20,000, and some numbers are even greater than that. And then what you get is you get into the dedicatory prayer of the house, of the temple in 1 Kings 8. And once you get into the prayer, listen to this, it has nothing to do with sacrifice. There's not a single peep about killing anything. In fact, the whole purpose of the house, once you get into the prayer proper, it's about prayer. When your people pray towards this place, when your people are scattered and the enemy has done this to them and they pray towards this place, when a stranger who's not of your people pray toward this place, prayer, 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 prayer. It's a house of prayer for all people. That's the only thing you get from reading this text. And then at the end, after the prayer is over, it says, and let's not forget the sacrifices. Here we go, verse 62 of chapter 8. "The king and all Israel with him offered sacrifices before the Lord. Solomon offered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep as sacrifices of well-being to the Lord. Thus, the king and all the Israelites dedicated the house of the Lord." And I know a lot of fundamentalist apologists love these particular texts and use this to say that sacrifices are part of the plan of God. And all I can think of when I read that is texts like Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. What does God really want? What does he want? Thousands of rivers of oil and sacrifices and so forth? And the answer to that is a resounding no. It's not what he wants. Now, why did I get into the temple? What does that have to do with anything? Because the biblical writers and the commentators from the earliest text to the latest text make an association between the tent and the later temple. Now, I'm not going to go to 2 Samuel 7 and how David first has this idea of building God a house, and God said, "I never asked for a house." We're not going to go there right now. That's for a later class. But we're going to think about the connection between tent and temple, because that is what the biblical writers want of us. It's what the biblical writers have drawn into the narrative to make these associations and to make these particular texts. This connection from tent to temple is, it begins properly in Torah portion, Terumah. Terumah is where the house for God, the idea of making a house for God in the midst of people, it's where it begins. And I know some people could say, well, technically you might go back to the garden. I get that, but I'm talking about actually making a place, a Mikdash, a Mishkan. And so from here out, again, the priestly writers make the sanctuary the focus. Okay, now that is the introduction. But a careful reading of the preceding narrative, right before we get to Terumah, right before we get to chapter 25, there's no doubt, by the way, let me make this point before I do this. From the time you get to 25, Exodus 25, all the way through chapter 40, It's all about this house for God, a terrestrial home for the God of heaven. Terrestrial home for the God of heaven, 25 to 40. And by the way, then Leviticus picks up the same priestly schema. And then you get to the book of Numbers, and it is the same. You get to Deuteronomy, and it's totally different, but we're going to get there. We're going to get there. We're going to do this all today. So a careful reading of the text right before you get to chapter 25, right before you get into this priestly material, there's another narrative that just, it's going to feel like it's interrupted. All right. Okay. So let me see if I'm right on that. Go to Exodus 24, verse 12 through 18, and that's on page 142 of the Torah tablet, if you have that. Exodus 24, beginning in verse 12. Again, this is the ASV. And Jehovah said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount, and be there, and I'll give thee the tables of stone, the law and the commandment which I've written, that you mayest teach them. And Moses rose up, and Joshua his minister, and Moses went up into the mount of God, and he said unto the elders, tarry ye here for us, until we come again unto you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whosoever hath a cause, let him come near unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and the cloud covered the mount, and the glory of Jehovah abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days, and the seventh day called out unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the appearance of the glory of Jehovah was like a devouring fire on top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses entered into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mount, and Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. Okay. Now, just setting the stage. God tells Moses, come up to me in the mountain, and I'm going to give you tables of stone, the law, and the commandment which I have written. Now, this is a key. What law did God write? What's it talking about here? The writer wants you to think one thing, but now I want you to go with me all the way to the completion of this narrative, which I think could be interrupted. Go with me to chapter 31 and verse 18. It's on page 192 of the Torah tablet. 31:18 says the following. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, the 2 tables of the testimony, tables of stone written with the finger of God. Okay? So the idea is, come up here to me, and I'm going to give you the tables of stone. So we've had the encounter on the day of the assembly, as Deuteronomy calls that day 3 times, only in Deuteronomy, the day of assembly from the midst of the fire on the mountain, right? And God spoke audibly the 10 words, which are called variously the covenant and so forth, but he didn't hand Moses the tablets at that time. It's later, not much later, but it's later, and he says, come up here and I'm going to give you those laws that I've written for you, right? What laws did God write? This is the key. Now, look with me at chapter 32 of Exodus, verse 15 through 16, and that's on page 196. I'm going to just pick up part B. The 2 tables of the testimony in his hand, tables that were written on both their sides, on the one side and on the other they were written. On this and this is the way the Hebrew says it. On this and this is written on this and this. And the tables were the work of God. And the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the tables. All right. Between the command to come up for the tablets, come up here, Moses, and get these tablets that contain the words that I've written for you, and the reception of the same, quite a bit is covered. Presumably, for most students, that which is covered between come up and get the tablets and Moses going to get the tablets is material. It says he's there for 40 days and 40 nights. He's not talking to him for 40 days and 40 nights because we get the idea, first of all, there's 7 days and it's in the darkness and then he calls to him. But a lot of people say, well, he gives Moses all these other laws, like about the tabernacle. This is the way most people understand this. This is what I want you to consider. Presumably, what is covered during that encounter is the Torah and the mitzvah, as it's called in Hebrew, which, according to most interpreters, is not the 10 words. It's other material. It's make for me a sanctuary. I'm going to show you here in the mountain and so forth. But this priestly tabernacle material is an unexpected sequel, and it feels to be interruptive from the narrative between the verse 12 through 18 that we read, all the way and when you get to 31 and verse 18. But what follows? What follows in this period, according to the priestly pens, are descriptions of things shown to Moses in the mountain. It's not just a verbal relaying of information. He doesn't just tell Moses what he needs. According to the priestly pen, he's shown. Now, what does that showing look like? Well, we get a hint. It has something to do, first of all, what he shows him has something to do, according to the priestly pen, with the making of a Mikdash, a holy place, ultimately a Mishkan. In the Hebrew, these visions, if you will, what he sees are referred to in Hebrew as tavnith. Now, tavnith is an interesting word. It appears 20 times in 17 verses in the Hebrew Bible, and the root word behind tavnith is bana. You hear v'nit, the v and the noon sound, the b and the n sound. Bana means to build. It's a verb to build. A tavnith is like a building plan. We might call it a blueprint. We might call it a pattern, but he shows him something. Now, how are we to imagine this? So I don't know. I mean, we could read it. Some have thought of this as a hologram, where something comes up and it's like three-dimensional. None of this stuff is in the biblical text. It just says that he showed him something in the mount, and the word used is tavnith. So again, does it mean, I think a building plan is probably the best way to think about this, and so you would call it a blueprint or a model even. Maybe he showed him a model or a replica. The word is used sometimes for a replica in the text. Now, specifically, what we're talking about, according to the priestly pen, is that Moses was shown something. And we're going to look at some texts which say this, because there is a cautionary note that's attached to this over and over in the Bible, particularly in the priestly portion of this building process, where it says, make sure, Moses, that you make it just like what you were shown in the mountains. So let's look at a few texts. Exodus 25 and verse 9. We read this earlier, page 144 in the Torah tablet, but let's look at it again. We're just going to go through a few of these. Exodus 25, verse 9. According to all that I show thee, the pattern, the tavnith, it says, of the tabernacle, and the pattern, the tavnith of all the furniture thereof, even so shall you make it. In other words, don't deviate. Don't deviate. Make it according to the pattern. Everything has to be precise. Now look at page 150, which is verse 40 of chapter 25. Verse 40. And see that thou make them after their pattern. That's the root word again, tavnith, which has been shown thee in the mountain. Okay? Look at chapter 26, verse 30, which is on page 156. 26, verse 30, 156. Here we go. It says the following. 26, verse 30 says, And you shall rear up the tabernacle according to the fashion thereof, which hath been showed thee in the mountain. Right? And then chapter 27 and verse 8 is page 160. I'm just going through the references to the tavnith. 27 verse 8. Hollow with planks shalt thou make it, as it has been showed thee in the mountain, so shall they make it. Right? You see the idea over and over is that you've been shown something. Now look at Numbers chapter 8 and verse 4. Numbers chapter 8 and verse 4, because this also is a use of this particular phrase. Now, this is how the lampstand was made. It was hammered work of gold, hammered from base to pedal, according to the pattern that the Lord had shown Moses, so was the lampstand made. Right? Now, it can also mean a replica. It can mean a replica. Look with me at Joshua chapter 22 and verse 28. Joshua 22, 28. This is a fascinating story, by the way. We don't have time to get into it today because it's outside the scope of my class. It doesn't fit the tavnith, the pattern that I want to show you. But this word is used. Look at 22, verse 28. We reasoned, should they speak thus to us and to our children in time to come, we would reply, see the replica, the tavnith, of the Lord's altar which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but as a witness between you and us. It goes on. This is a story in Joshua 22 where Israelites living east of the Jordan made an altar, which in Hebrew is mizbeach. Mizbeach means what is a slaughter place. But this is a mizbeach, an altar that doesn't have anything to do with killing, which I think is fascinating and opens up the possibility of other altars that are not used for killing. This is a replica. It's a tavnith, if you will. Now, one other passage on the tavnith that I want to look at, and I'd like you to look at this with me because I think it's fascinating, and I've thought about this for many years. Look at 1 Chronicles chapter 28, 1 Chronicles chapter 28, and we're going to read verse 11 through verse 19. And David gave his son Solomon the plan. What's he given him? In Hebrew, he gave him the tavnith. What is the tavnith? It's the word we're talking about, all right? Verse 11, David gave his son Solomon the plan of the porch and its houses, its storerooms, its upper chambers and inner chambers, and of the place of the ark cover, and the plan of all that he had by the Spirit of the courts of the house of the Lord and all its surrounding chambers, and of the treasuries of the house of God and of the treasuries of the holy things, the divisions of priests and Levites for all the work of the service of the house of the Lord, and all the vessels of the service of the house of the Lord, the gold, the weight of gold, for vessels of every sort of use, silver for all the vessels of silver by weight, for all the vessels of every kind of service, the weight of the gold lampstands and their gold lamps, and the weight of the silver lampstands, each lampstand and its silver lamps according to the use of every lampstand, and the weight of gold for the tables of the rows of bread for each table, and of silver for the silver tables, and of pure gold for the forks and the basins and the jars, and the weights of the gold bowls, every bowl, and the weight of the silver bowls, each and every bowl, the weight of refined gold for the incense altar, and the gold for the figure of the chariot, the cherubs those who with outspread wings screening the ark of the covenant of the Lord. All this that the Lord made me understand by his hand on me, I give you in writing the plan of all the works. What he says is, and by the way, this translation I'm about to show you is not very literal because it gets into some things which make people think too deeply. And a lot of times translators don't want us to think too deeply, especially if it challenges certain theological points. But this is a plan. This is describing the tavnith, a plan, a blueprint, if you will, a model, something that God gave to David, that David gave to Solomon. Again, this is priestly material. We are in the world of the priest, boys and girls. And when we're in the world of the priest, we have to understand the way they think, the things that they're driving. And what they want to do is they want us to connect, for good reason, the tabernacle, the tent, with the temple. And they're both built upon or based upon a building plan that comes from God. Now, I want to look at, just to get a more literal translation, let's look at 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 19 from the ASV, which is much closer. So here's what it says. All this, said David, have I been made to understand in writing from the hand of Jehovah, even all the works of this pattern. The natural reading of this text in the Hebrew and in the English here is that this is something written by God and given to David, and David gives it to Solomon. Now, for those who think that that's a little bit of a stretch, look at it closely, consider it. We'll talk about this in the after-class discussion, and I'm sure that, as always, everyone will come out and see it my way. That's not really true. But anyway, it's important to stress that all the priestly writers describe, in other words, everything that the priestly writers describe as having to be made according to the pattern shown to Moses in the mountain. Every bit of this. There's a lot, too. There's a lot of cool stuff. How about the Urim and the Thummim? This, whatever the Urim and the Thummim, the ephod, the breastplate of judgment, the Choshan, everything that's described in these chapters about the tabernacle, this terrestrial home for the God of heaven, of all that's described, none of it's left. We don't have any of it. Nothing. Not a thing. Nothing that is described exists. And so we have to think about what are the important things that we're to get from the biblical text. How much of this is needed to have a relationship with God? And this is part of what I want to share as we work through and we get all interested and enamored with these various things that are described. I'd love to know a little bit more about the Urim and the Thummim. We're gonna talk about some of these things in the next few weeks. But how much do we really know? Well, a lot of it is based on very scarce evidence in the text of the Bible because it doesn't exist anymore. And so it's important to think what really is important when it comes to faith and practice. We want to say, look, I follow the religion of the Bible. Do you? Okay. So I want to keep that in focus as we look at all these interesting things. Nothing remains of any of this. Most of it was gone it was either sacked or destroyed during First Temple times. By the time we get to the end of the First Temple period, in the time of when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple, and stuff was missing already. This is a point I want to make. So a lot of people look at, say, the Arch of Titus, and they see a depiction of the candelabra, the menorah. The question that I would have is, which is that? Do you think that is the one that Moses made? No, that one's been gone. In fact, Jono and I did a show one time where we looked at every one of the sackings of the temple where things were stolen or a certain king gave the treasures away because he, wanted to appease some invading army or whatever. But by the time you get to the end of the First Temple period, multiple events in the Hebrew Bible have described how the objects were either stolen or given away to invading forces. At any rate, even the chief object, the holiest piece, the most sacred object in all of this, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, has been missing at present for more than 2,600 years. In fact, roughly 2,647, if I could do the math right. It's been gone. Now, an interesting piece that I want us to keep in front of us is that Jeremiah, who very likely saw it, very likely saw the real deal, the ark, the box, and most likely the same Jeremiah, I believe, had something to do with its disappearance, said the following: "It," the ark, "shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. It shall not be made again." Now, a lot of times I talk to my fundamentalist friends who look at the Torah as we have it, the Pentateuch as we have it, and they get this idea that it is as it is, Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12, that it is this eternal document that is correct in every measure and will go on forever and through into eternity. I want you to think about when that Torah portion comes around, Terumah, in Exodus 25, and we're sitting around in heaven, and it's somebody's turn to read, and they have to read about the ark, and you can imagine the blank stare on everyone's face when they say, "What are you talking about?" Because, according to Jeremiah, they won't even miss it. They're not going to think about it. It's not going to come to mind. So something's got to happen. Something's got to change. And one of the things that we have to do is look at these texts and say, when did these certain aspects come in? When did they disappear? You know, the second temple, that it never had many of these objects. Why is that? Because they were already gone. They're already gone. So let's look for a moment at the ark. Let's look at this ark. In Hebrew, the ark is aron. Aron, it means a box or a chest. Now, the priestly writers call the box the chest of the testimony chest, or the ark of the testimony. In Hebrew, aron ha'edut, the ark of the testimony. Only the priestly writers, they refer to the edut. The edut is the priestly name for the two stone tablets. Let's look at a few passages. Look with me at Exodus 25, verse 16. Let's go to page 146 in the Torah tablet. And we're going to look at the priestly name for the two stone tablets. Exodus 25, 16. And you shall put into the ark, into the box, into the chest, the testimony which I shall give you. What is the testimony? Look at verse 21. And you shall put the mercy seat above upon the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. Look at 31:18. This is on page 192. 192 and 31:18. Here we go again. You heard this earlier. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, the 2 tables of the testimony, tables of stone written with the finger of God. And by the way, that last verse, 32:15 and 16 on page 196, we read that as well. So the testimony is the priestly writer's way of describing the 2 stone tablets. They then are put into a specially crafted box, according to the priestly narrative, called the box. It's a box called the box. It's the ark, as it's called, for the testimony. Let's look at. So the chest is called the Aron Ha'edut, the box of the testimony, and the Mishkan is called the Mishkan of the testimony. Look at Exodus 38, verse 21. This is on page 238 if you have the tablet. Here we go. Exodus 38 and 21. This is the sum of the things for the tabernacle, even the tabernacle of the testimony, as they were counted, according to the commandment of Moses, for the service of the Levites by the hand of Itamar, the son of Aaron, the priest. And look with me a few other passages. Let's look at the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 1, and I want to look at verse 50. Numbers 1, verse 50 says, you shall put the Levites in charge of the tabernacle of the pact, this says, the tabernacle of the testimony, all its furnishings and everything that pertains to it. They shall carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings, and they shall tend it, and they shall camp around the tabernacle. Look at verse 53. The Levites, however, shall camp around the tabernacle of the testimony, that wrath may not strike the Israelite community, etc. And then verse 10, chapter 10 and verse 11, you can look at on your own. Now, a couple of other passages I want to look at in Numbers. This is a slight variation in the priestly writing where it refers to this not as the tabernacle of the testimony, but this is called the tent of the testimony. Look at Numbers chapter 9, verse 15. Numbers chapter 9 and verse 15. And one second, I just want to read a couple of these. Numbers 9 and 15 says, let me get to there. On the day that the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent, the Ohel Ha'edut. The Ohel Ha'edut, in the evening it rested over the tabernacle in the likeness of fire until the morning. And then one more passage, look at Numbers 17. I've got a couple up there, but just for time, let's look at Numbers 17, verse 22. And it says, Moses deposited the staffs before the Lord in the tent of the pack, in the Ohel Ha'edut. And the last reference is in chapter 18 and verse 2. So here's the point. You have, according to the priestly writer, you have the Edut, the 2 stone tablets upon which are written the 10 words, the same 10 words that were spoken from the mountain, from the midst of the fire, on the day of assembly by God. They're later written on these 2 stone tablets. The 2 stone tablets are to be placed in the box for them. It's for them. That's what it's for. Nothing else is in the box. 1 Kings 8 and 9, 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 9 says so. And there's also a passage in Chronicles that says the same. I think it's 2 Chronicles 5:10. Nothing is in the ark except those 2 stone tablets. That's what it's made for. The writer of Hebrews 9:4, and other Jewish traditional passages, other Jewish literature, put all sorts of things in the box. Jar of manna, Aaron's rod that budded. They put, before long, it's got all sorts of stuff jammed in the box. That's not what the box was for. Okay. The ark, according to the priestly writer, the ark of the Adut and other sacred items are made by 2 spirit-filled artisans named Bezalel and Aholiab in strict accordance with what's called the tavnith. They don't just make this according to their whim. According to the priestly writer, it's got to be according to the pattern, the tavnith, the blueprint that was shown to you in the mountain. Don't deviate. Make it just like you saw it in the mountain. And these people are spirit-filled to ensure that they make it just like they saw it. Interestingly, Deuteronomy, please understand when I say never, I mean never. Interestingly, Deuteronomy never refers to the 2 stone tablets as the Adut. Deuteronomy doesn't call the 2 stone tablets the testimony. That term is used only exclusively by the writer, which is a different writer or different writers of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The priestly authors all agree this is called the Adut, the testimony. Deuteronomy doesn't know that term when it's describing the 2 stone tablets. In fact, what Deuteronomy calls the 2 stone tablets, because it talks about the 2 stone tablets, it just doesn't call them the Adut. It calls them the covenant. So the box, according to Deuteronomy, is the box or the chest of the covenant chest, the Ark of the Covenant. So if you know the phrase Ark of the Covenant, you know that because you might not have known this, but you are touched by the phrasing of the Deuteronomic writer, not the priestly writer of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So Spielberg, right? He'd been to a lot of synagogue services. Deuteronomy never mentions the Adut. Get this. If you want to write down something else Deuteronomy never mentions, it's the tabernacle. Can you believe that? Deuteronomy doesn't even mention the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the Mikdash. It's like you would think that somewhere in there it would mention it. Now, there's one passage in Deuteronomy 31, verses 14 and 15. Some of you went there immediately in your mind and said, wait a minute, Ross made a mistake here. It does mention the tabernacle in Deuteronomy 31, verse 14 and 15. Put this in your Torah tablet and go look at it later. It appears more likely to be a different, it's not talking about the Mishkan or the Mikdash. It does refer to the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, but I just want you to know that there are different tents of meeting, all right? There's a tent of meeting that the priestly writer puts at the center of the camp, and it's the one where all the slaughtering takes place and all that. It's the tabernacle. It's the priestly tabernacle, the Ohel Moed. But there's another Ohel Moed, another tent of meeting, which is where Moses pitches a tent, not in the middle of the camp, as Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers would have it, but outside the camp. It's Exodus chapter 33. Look at verse 7 and following in your own time. That's the other Ohel Moed, the other tent of meeting. And that, by the way, is what we're talking about in Deuteronomy 31, 14, and 15, most likely. Deuteronomy does not know about Bezalel and Aholiab, the 2 spirit-filled artisans. In Deuteronomy, Moses makes the chest for the two tablets of the covenant. I've always referred to James Tabor's article on that other Ark of the Covenant, and I'll post a link to that later if you haven't read it. I think many of you probably already have, but he brought my attention to this years ago. And what is amazing is that Deuteronomy, again, doesn't have the Spielberg box that's made popular in movie and book and film and photo and picture and so forth. It's a box that Moses made. Deuteronomy 10, verses 1 through 3. Interestingly enough, the Moses scroll also, which I believe is an ancient and authentic text, doesn't know of these things that I'm saying Deuteronomy doesn't know about either. It's very similar in some ways to a Deuteronomic text. It knows that Moses made an ark and not Bezalel and Aholiab. Now, we're going to talk more about this in the after-class discussion. As far as the word tavnith, because tavnith, again, is used 20 times in 17 verses. It's the plan, the blueprint, the pattern that was shown to Moses in the mount, and Deuteronomy doesn't know anything about it. Deuteronomy does use the word. It uses the word, but it's not what you think. It's not something that you're to do and make according to something called the tavnith. Tavnith is used there in the sense of making something not proper. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, beginning in verse 16. I want to read you what Deuteronomy, the only thing Deuteronomy says about the word tavnith. Deuteronomy 4, beginning in verse 16. Not to act wickedly and make for yourselves a sculptured image or any likeness, whatever, the form of a man or a woman, the form of any beast on earth, the form of any winged thing that flies in the sky, the form of anything that creeps on the ground, the form of any fish that is in the heavens below the earth. And when you look upon up to the sky and behold the sun and the moon and the stars and so forth and so on, what the use, when Moses, or the writer of Deuteronomy, first person, appears to be Moses at least in many cases, what is the only occurrence of tavnith in that text is, don't make anything the form of this or the form of that or the form of this or the form of that. It's a totally different approach. It's hard to reconcile, I get it. It's hard to reconcile the divergent accounts in our sources at times. Different sources give different words of the covenant. If you read Exodus 20, which reports to be the words that God spoke from the mountain on the day of assembly, the midst of the fire, from the midst of the fire, you read Exodus 20 and you look at it compared to Deuteronomy 5, they're not the same. There are different names for the tablets. The priestly writer, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, refers to these stone tablets as the Adut. Deuteronomy never calls them the Adut, but always refers to them as the tablets of the testimony. There are different names for the maker of the ark. The priestly writer, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, is describing an ark made according to the priestly source by the spirit-filled artisans Bezalel and Aholiab. The writer of Deuteronomy doesn't know that. The writer of Deuteronomy says that Moses made the ark. Today, there's no tabernacle, there's no tent, there's no temple, there's no ark. The tablets have gone missing. And what are we to do? Well, let's start by meeting me in a Zoom call right now you go, get ready, and join me in the Zoom. We're going to discuss these things and much, much more. By the way, we have changed the Zoom link. If you're a member of the Yachad, thank you very much for supporting what we're doing here. You will find the new link in all the places where you support us, whether that is YouTube or Discord or Patreon. If you still can't find it there, go where you normally go to get that link and join us, because we want you to be part of the Zoom discussion. The rest of you who are not yet members of the Yachad, we want you to join us as well. You'll be redirected for about 45 minutes of that conversation on YouTube. It's good to be with you today. Thank God we're here to discuss the most important matters on the planet. I'll see you there in a few minutes.